Don't we just all love refilming videos? I know I do. Or at least I do it often. But so yeah, my audio sucked on the previous attempt, so we're gonna make another attempt. But this is also an opportunity for me to take less time to talk about these books. But so today we're going over the books that I've read so far in the month of October. In my mid-month check-ins, I usually go over what I've read so far within the month, what I'm currently reading, and give you guys a kind of prognosis when it comes to my October TBR, whether I'll be able to finish it. So let's just dive into the books that I've read so far in the month of October. Month of October has actually been treating me quite well when it comes to my reading productivity. I've really been having a good time when it comes to picking up books. I've really been motivated to keep on reading, to keep on reducing my TBR. But in terms of like what I've been reading, sadly a lot of these, or like not a lot of these, but there are a significant amount of books that I've been reading this month that have left me disappointed or unsatisfied. So let's just go over the books. First off, we have one that came over from my September TBR. I wasn't able to finish it within the month of September, and that is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. This is the first book in the First Law trilogy. This is fantasy, adult fantasy. It is grimdark fantasy. So basically, we spare no prisoners. You know, there is gore, there is blood and things like that within this book. And I will say that I kind of felt like it wasn't grimdark for a big portion of this book, though we do start with some pretty grimdark scenes from the beginning of this book onwards. But like for a very big part around the midway section of this book, things were pretty chill, pretty mellow in my opinion. But definitely towards the ending of the book, there are a lot of scenes that really bring out the grimdark nature of this book again. This book is very much referred to as a character-driven book because, especially in the first one, because I have only read this one and cannot speak for the rest of the books, but in this one definitely there isn't much of a direction to the plots. If you looking back on the story, there is definitely a trajectory that the story took, but for a big part of this book, when I was reading it, I didn't really feel like I knew where the story was going to go. And that ultimately also had an impact on my reading of this book because for a big portion of it, I, didn't really have a push forward when it came to reading. I didn't want to get to a certain part. I didn't have that forward momentum when it came to the story. And so I will say that I enjoyed this book, but I also wasn't blown away with this. This was basically a 5-star prediction. I was expecting to absolutely fall in love with it because I am very much a character-focused reader and I love character work in fantasy stories. But while I did like the character work within this one, ultimately it left me wanting a little bit more. So in this one, we're basically following mainly 3 characters at the beginning of the story. We are following our Inquisitor called Glokta, which is very much a character that is a fan favorite. He used to be a sort of like star soldier, the, young hotshot within the army who had won the tournament and, who had a bright future ahead of him. However, in the war, he got captured by the opposing forces and he was tortured to the point where he is now a cripple. And so within this one, I very much enjoyed his perspective because I really love the way in which we see him struggling on a day-to-day basis with the sort of like easiest of tasks from time to time, but at the same time being this sort of like ruthless character, and this character that is universally feared. Everybody who comes across him has this sort of instinctive fear response because there's something that he exudes that just imbibes fear into the body of the people who he meets. And so I kind of love that mix of disability representation in such a strong character like Glokta. Secondly, we have Captain Jazal, who's basically the sort of new up-and-coming soldier within this army. He's basically the new hotshot. He's training to become the new champion. But he, on the other hand, doesn't really have the passion, doesn't really have the discipline. And then thirdly, our main character that we're following, aside from those, is a character called Logan Ninefingers, who is basically this legendary sort of figure that a lot of people don't even realize is a real person. And he has gotten himself in a little bit of a tight spot. Originally, these 3 storylines don't necessarily overlap a whole lot, but as the story progresses, they will move in each other's circles and they will start to form part of an overarching plot. I did enjoy this one. As I said, I was a little bit underwhelmed, but I do want to continue on with this one, but I don't know when yet. So definitely it's not going to happen in 2021 anymore, but maybe in 2022 I'll pick up the rest of this series. Second book that I then finished in the month of October was very much an October read. I was reading it for Victober, which is a readathon in which we read Victorian literature in the month of October. And so I have had this one on my October TBR a few times before, and I've actually even already tried it a few times, but I never got past the sort of opening section, and that is Wuthering by Emily Bronte. So I read this one. I basically listened to it mainly on audio, though I also read parts of this physically as well. But so I do definitely highly enjoy the story. I mean, enjoy is very much a wrong word for this one. I very much respect the story. I very much appreciate the story overall, and I think it is a masterful story in and of itself. You know, I think it is very well structured as well, and it has this nice sort of like mirroring effect between the two Catherines that are presented in this story. However, it is a very bleak, a very depressing read at the same time as well. So in Wuthering Heights, basically we are introduced to the story of Wuthering Heights through a sort of outsider perspective. We have an outsider who comes into the neighborhood and he stumbles upon the character of Heathcliff. And Heathcliff is a sort of grumpy old man living in a household with two younger people who seem to resent him a great deal. And so our protagonist is very much intrigued by the character of Heathcliff and wants to know his backstory. And so we will be exploring the tragic story of Heathcliff and Catherine through the story that her housekeeper tells him. And so I think the structuring of this is very interesting and it works very well. Originally, I have always struggled with the beginning, and I think that the beginning is its weak point to that extent because, you know, it's not a fun start, but there's also nothing fun about this story. There's nothing light about this story. This story is all misery, it's all gloom. And so it is a little bit difficult to get into to begin with. And because we are not starting our narrative from the sort of like beginning, but we're jumping on somewhere in a sort of lull period in the middle of the story, I think that I struggled a little bit the first times I tried to read this. But when you push past those first few chapters and get to the point in the story in which they're starting to relate what came before, I definitely think that it's very well done, very well crafted, but personally it's just not a favorite because of how dark and gloomy and miserable it is. I just want a little bit more light in my reading apparently, because I did definitely have to put this one down quite often because I was like, give me something cheerful, give me something nice, because these characters are, first of all, half of them are obnoxious and are horrible people. And secondly, they only do horrible and obnoxious things to one another. So yeah, I would definitely recommend you guys. I think it is one that you need to at least try, because I think it definitely has potential to be people's favorite classic. It definitely is such a strong story that it has that potential. But for me, the gloom was just like, it was a tough time getting through it in that sense of the word. Next up, my favorite read of the month so far, and that is a reread of The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. So I've already read The Emperor's Soul quite a few years ago. It was like the first Brandon Sanderson I read outside of the Mistborn series, and I remember really liking it at that point in time. I remember thinking it was great, but because I don't hear people talk about it very often, or, you know, really I don't hear a lot of people mention this book, I had already forgotten what it was mainly about, and, you know, I hadn't reinvigorated that appreciation of this story, I guess. But when I reread it, I was like, oh yes, I absolutely do love this story, and I think it is actually one of Brandon Sanderson's strongest works, because I think he utilizes the page count he has here perfectly. So in this one, we are following our protagonist called Shai, who is basically a forger. Now, forgers in this world are very much looked down upon because their skill is seen as being blasphemous. They basically kind of have the possibility to alter reality to some extent. They can change the history of an object, the history of a soul, in order to transform an object or a person. Now, our protagonist Shai has been captured at the beginning of this book, and she is offered an opportunity. She can redeem herself, she can be released out into the world again if she restores the soul of the emperor. And so throughout this book, she has 100 days to restore the emperor's soul. However, restoring a soul is a very complex thing. It's not as easy as perhaps recreating the story of a vase or, you know, an inanimate object. In order to restore a soul, you need to fully grasp every aspect of it, all of its nuances. And I love the magic system in this one. This book is set within the same world as Elantris, and so it definitely has some similarities with the Aeons within that magic system, but it definitely also reminded me of Shallan's magic system within Roshar. I love the magic system in this one, as I said, and I like the Asian inspiration for that. So some of the inspiration behind this, for example, is historically seals have been used by Chinese to kind of indicate which workshop certain items came from, for example. And apparently, as it says in the afterword here, sometimes rulers would also put their own stamp on a piece of art, for example, as a sort of like seal of approval. And so in this forgery magic, they also need to use seals in order to be able to change the history of an object. And I like that sort of idea of forgery, but you still have a trace of the forgery, you know. You cannot remove that seal. That seal will always be a sign of the fact that some sort of a forgery has taken place. But there's a whole lot about this story that I'm not going to dive into here because it is still a novella, of course. But I really liked this world. I liked our character. I liked the exploration we have of the magic system and how deep we were able to go into the magic system in an under 200-page novella. But so yeah, I would highly recommend this one, and I actually think I might start recommending it as a way into the Cosmere. I definitely think it holds up for that as well. It is a good mix of a lot of Brandon Sanderson's strengths, and it is another case where you are immediately introduced to the magic system versus some of his other works where the magic system is something that needs to be retrieved, recovered, and so one of his big strengths, the magic system, is missing at the beginning of the book. So with this one, you have that immediately, and you don't have a daunting page count to start off with. Next up, we have a book that is such a disappointment for me because I basically kind of broke my book buying ban, but I don't really have a book buying ban, but I basically was intending not to buy any more books for the remaining quarter of the year, and then I decided to forego that idea in order to buy this book, but I knew like I'll get around to it almost immediately, so that's fine. But then I didn't like it. So the book we're talking about is pretty popular at the moment, and that is The Cat Who Saved Books by Sosuke and Natsukawa. And so this is a book translated from Japanese. It just came out, and I see it a lot in like bookshop displays online, at least for the Waterstones. And so it is like a marketer's dream when it comes to books. It is a book that, you know, with this gorgeous cover that they created for it, immediately highlights the two things about it. It's got a cat, it's got books. Which book lover doesn't like a book about books? And a lot of book lovers also love cats. And so I was immediately drawn to this the same way that a lot of other people are. And for me, it had the added dimension of it being a Japanese book. I love Japanese books, and I should have known that I have hit or miss relationships with Japanese books about cats, but I was hoping for the best, and it ended up really disappointing me. So this one is a book in which we are following our protagonist Rintaro. His grandfather has just passed away, and his grandfather owned a bookshop, but so Rintaro is kind of preparing the bookshop to be closed off because he needs to move away to live with his aunt. And one of those days he is visited by a cat, and the cat asks his help to save some books. And so throughout the story we will be going through certain labyrinths, and in each labyrinth there is a sort of like a villainous character who is in some way or another harming books. Now this is very much a simplistic style story. It's very much sort of like parable or fairy tale style, in which everything that is being presented is presented in a very black or white way, and as a result the story becomes very condescending to certain type of reading, in my opinion. It very much defends a sort of like elitist, rigorous view on reading and what constitutes good reading, good literature, and I'm just not down with that, you know. In one of the labyrinths within this story, you basically have this sort of like publisher who is putting out easy books, in the sense that they sell. They are books that sell. And so the story basically contrasts books that sell versus books that are worthwhile. And so indicating that any sort of book that is going to sell well, any sort of a best-selling book, is automatically worthless or is automatically lacking in quality, and very much selling a sort of elitist view that all reading needs to be quality work, all reading needs to be deep, profound, needs to critically hold up, and that, you know, any type of sort of like easy escapist reading is automatically worthless. And so I absolutely do not stand by that view. And so that really made me dislike the book. But I was already finding it difficult to get through the book at that stage because of its simplistic style. And because of that, I didn't really have a bond with our protagonist. There were these sort of small glimpses here and there of our protagonist thinking back on the time with his grandfather, for example, that I really enjoyed. But then for a very big part of the book, I really wasn't engaging with the protagonist. And so that in combination with that sort of like simplistic, formulaic style of the rest of the story didn't really work for me. But so this ultimately ended up really being a big disappointment. Moving on to another disappointing read, because it's basically a DNF, and that is The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell. So I've not read David Mitchell, and so I do, based on reviews, see that this is kind of different from most of his writing, and so maybe I'll give his writing another go at some point, but I was just really struggling with this one. It took me forever to get through the first 28 pages, it felt like at least, and then I already wanted to DNF, but I kind of told myself I wanted to get to the 50-page mark to do that, because I don't DNF easily, but I couldn't do it. Like, I put it off for like a further 3 days, then when I finally started it, I fell asleep 15 times in 2 pages or something like that. So ultimately I decided that it wasn't working for me. I looked over some of the reviews, and yes, there are some people who really love this story, but for me, I'm gonna hope that my later experience with this book would have been in line with all of those people who say that they found it extremely boring. So this one takes place off of the coast of Japan in the 18th century, I think, and Japan was very much a closed nation at that point in time. Foreigners weren't welcome. But so there is this port, I think it was the Nagasaki, it was near Nagasaki, I think. Yeah. And so in the port of Nagasaki, there is basically a small island linked to the mainland through a bridge. And on that small island, that's where the Westerners are able to do trade with the Japanese. And so there's only this small portion of an island where there's contact between Japanese and Westerners. But the only thing I get off of this premise is that that is enough to have a meeting of minds, basically. So it is very much told from the perspective of the Westerners. I don't know whether we would later on get some Japanese perspectives or not, but we very much already have some offensive terms being used in the first 28 pages that already didn't really sit too well with me. And so I wasn't really looking forward to a Western gaze, a Western colonizer's gaze on that period of time in Japan. And so I ultimately decided that it wasn't worth me pushing through it, so putting that one down. And so that's all that I've read so far in the first half of the month, so I'm quite happy with that, because that is 5 books that I completed like that. One of them was a novella, but okay. And I have also made progress in more than just that. So in terms of what I have been reading in that first half, there are 2 other books that I'm in the middle of. One is an impromptu reread of Skyward by Brönte and Sanderson. So the 3rd book in the series is coming out in November, so I decided to pick this one back up before I'm going to dive into the novellas and then into Cytonic. And I actually picked this one up when I decided to put down The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. And so on that same day when I was struggling to get through 2 pages and I was falling asleep every 5 seconds trying to read those 2 pages, I also read over 100 pages of Skyward right after without falling asleep for a single second. So clearly that was the right choice for me. So I'm now like halfway through it. I will like kind of keep it on the side for the moment. I'm going to try and get to my final TBR book first, but I will probably read like a few chapters of this still like every day and then hopefully get to it by the end of the month. And then the other book that I'm currently in the middle of is The State of Fear by Michael Crichton. This is a book that I'll talk in depth about in my end of month wrap up, but this is not going well. I initially gave it the benefit of the doubt because it became clear that this book is going to talk about climate change, and early on it already started to, like, there were indications that perhaps we were actually going to defend the position of climate change deniers. And so I just found that to be too weird. I couldn't really comprehend that he was going to do that. And so I was just hoping for a switch later on within the book. But when I got to like 2/3 of the way in the book, I finally looked it up online in reviews, what people were saying, and it does seem that we're gonna go with a climate change denial story, and that is a position that Michael Crichton had and is defending in this one. So I love Michael Crichton. I really love Jurassic Park. I have had mixed experiences with the other works by him that I've read, but none of them have disappointed me the way that this book is about to. But I am almost done with it. I am under 100 pages away from finishing it. I will be very intrigued about the author's notes and what his stance is going to be in that author's note. But yeah, it hasn't been a good time to some extent. It's been an okay time because it flies by. It is an action thriller. But in terms of whenever we are discussing the views on climate change and the truth about climate change, then it is quite difficult to get through. So that's what I'm currently reading. In terms of my TBR, I still have one book left on my TBR, which is The Republic of Thieves by Scott Lynch, the third book in the Gentleman Bastard series. And, you know, I will have no problems doing that. I will be reading some other stuff during the weekend, but on Monday I should be starting Gentleman Bastards. And so my hope is to finish it next week, and then I will have the final week of the month to kind of pick up some stuff at random, to kind of pick up whatever I'm in the mood for at that point in time. So I'm very happy with the way this month is panning out. I'm hoping to be able to reduce my physical TBR even further in that final week of the month. But in any case, I've already done a pretty good job so far this month. But so yeah, let me know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts are on them. Are they on your TBR? Are you looking forward to maybe getting around to them yourself at some point? And then we can discuss in the comments down below. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video and see you guys for the next one. Bye!